A Sons and Lovers by David Herbert Lawrence was first published in 1913. It's at least partially autobiographical, and yet it's considered one of the most important early 20th century works of fiction. It's the story of a young man from a working-class English background who navigates his relationships with family members and with romantic interests as he struggles with an intense artistic yearning. The novel centers on the Morel family, first the husband and wife, and then their 4 children, with a particular emphasis on the third child, Paul. The relationship between mother and son holds the most emotional weight in the book, even as Paul grows into young adulthood and pursues sexual affairs and romance. It appears that he can't fully commit to another woman while his mother is alive, as she is the one who truly ignites his full powers of perception and creativity. Sons and Lovers is really a character study and less driven by plot. Its intrigue is mostly psychological. The novel takes a long look at the interior space of its characters' unspoken desires and private concerns, with passages exploring the thoughts individuals have while appreciating a bunch of flowers, or considering the subtle implications of a particular head gesture or hand movement. And the style of the writing is distinct. If you've ever read any D.H. Lawrence before, it's immediately recognizable. It's loose with frequent expressions, idioms, and colloquial dialogue, but that's contrasted against lavish and evocative descriptions of scenery. Underneath all of this is a near sinister sense of anxiety and tension. It can be a challenging read because the writing is elusive at times and tends to be presented in long, grinding chapters, but the book's literary legacy cannot be denied. Sons and Lovers is notable for its honest and clear depiction of the working class and their struggle to rise up. It suggests that their struggles, their joys and pains, are just as worthy of dramatic narrative as those of a higher station. The uncertainty of youth and the revelatory force of tragedy play central roles in this novel, which make for a frustrating, heartbreaking, and ultimately rewarding read.
The first time I read this novel, it was 20 years ago as a student from this Penguin Trade paperback edition. It's part of their Viking Critical Library series, and it has a plain red cover with the title in blue. There are distinct breaks for Part 1 and 2, while each new chapter begins immediately after the previous one ends. It's packed with an abundance of extra material that would be especially useful to a student. Contextual documents, analysis, literary criticism, and even suggestions for potential papers. The printing is problematic at times, so when I had the chance to upgrade to a deluxe illustrated hardcover copy of this literary classic, I had to go for it. So let's do this. Here we have Sons and Lovers from the Folio Society. This beautiful edition was released in 2013. It's presented in a plain gray paper slipcase with a curved open edge. The book itself is 3/4 bound in dark gray cloth with an image on the paper front board. The illustration is by Anne Marie Jones and features a headless male torso and arms being embraced from behind by a female figure who's shaped by the negative space against a pale peach background. The posture and expression of this figure looks near biblical. It recalls a passage near the end of the novel. They were together, but yet there was his body, his chest that leaned against the stile. On the book's spine, the title and author names are recessed in this really classy decorative band. The publisher's initials are at the bottom of the spine in that same pale yellow color. The binding is finished with silver head and tail bands. When we crack the book open, we see plain gray end papers in a medium stock. The book is printed on Abbey wove paper, which is smooth and comes in at a slight cream color according to my color swatches. In this edition of the novel, each part has its own simple title page, and each chapter begins on a fresh page. If we bring back the Penguin edition for a brief side-by-side, we can see that the Folio Society version is indeed bigger, with an extra 4 centimeters in the height and 3 centimeters in the width. The font size is similar in the Folio version, but it has better spacing between the lines and a more generous margin, especially in the gutter, resulting in an improved reading experience. With the consistency issues in the paperback version, there's a marked improvement when it comes to the readability of this Folio copy, which features precise printing and much thicker and higher quality paper. Now, the Penguin copy features the original 1913 edition of the novel, but this folio edition presents the unexpurgated version of Sons and Lovers, which was first released by Cambridge University Press back in 1992. This is an unedited version of the text. Unexpurgated suggests that this version will be more explicit, and while it is indeed a bit saucier, it's also 10% longer, and it features Lawrence's original punctuation, so it's even more of an upgrade for me, as we've got a sort of director's cut of the novel itself in this book. There's a brief biography for the primary contributors to this edition, which is always appreciated. The introduction is by Colm Tóibín, an Irish author and critic. He begins by looking at Lawrence's poetry in his youth and his parents, before considering how these same elements are explored in the novel itself. He then considers the author's psychological approach and briefly outlines the competing factors that shape the protagonist's artistic and sexual maturity. Tóibín concludes his 5-page introduction by discussing Lawrence's struggle to finish the book and actually get it published, as well as the author's realization that he would soon be moving away from this style of writing in his subsequent work. The interior artwork, like the cover, is by Anne-Marie Jones. She also worked with the publisher on the 2015 version of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. She works in paint and then uses digital tools to collage and texture her work. This results in a style that is ideally suited to this particular novel, which is so concerned with works of art. The protagonist endeavors to paint the shimmering protoplasms and not the stiffness of the shape. This is a book that is less concerned with realism, but more concerned about the truth, and it often features discussions about abstraction. It's wonderful that the illustrations reflect this focus. The artwork is presented on thick, toothy matte paper, and the images typically land within a handful of pages from the text they correspond to, though in a few cases they are 20 or 30 pages away. Let's take a detailed look at that artwork now. The first illustration, the frontispiece, depicts Gertrude Morel. She sits with downcast eyes and her arms crossed, and we see her children's faces within her, which suggests how tightly she clings to her children. They come to make up most of her being. The earthy tones and textures give this piece a somber tone. The second illustration is also of Mrs. Morel. She's just been injured in a fight with her husband, who's represented by this soot-gray figure. She leans over young Paul, protecting the baby with her elongated arms, even as she bleeds on his shawl. The third illustration is a scene where young Paul watches the colliers walk home from the mines. The blacks and grays and cold blues dominate this image. I love the impressionistic style here, and this one might be my favorite of the bunch. The fourth image is from a scene that occurs near Christmas time. The eldest son, William, visits from London and introduces Miss Western to his mother. In her rigid posture and stern countenance, we can sense the aloof way that Mrs. Morel will receive the introduction. Check out how the collage technique has been used to help suggest the sparse furniture and fireplace here. The next illustration is of Mrs. Morel bent in grief. Her son William's coffin has just been brought into the house and placed upon 6 chairs. We can feel the mother's anguish as Paul looks on, looking an awful lot like D.H. Lawrence himself right here. The sixth image is from Miriam's perspective as she describes Paul's eyes, which could be so beautiful and tender, but also hateful and mocking. Here we get a super close-up of Paul's face, his eyes, nose, and mouth. The heavy blue brush lines and the collage texturing make this the most abstract of the illustrations in this set. It also calls back to the first piece and echoes one of the portraits that make up Gertrude. It's a really nice touch. The seventh image is from Paul's point of view, as he watches Miriam sing as his sister Annie plays the piano. He says Miriam's mouth looked hopeless, like a nun singing to heaven, and he finds her attractive, but paradoxically a figure of powerful spirituality too. Again, the collage effect and textures help bring dimension to this illustration. The eighth piece depicts Paul and his other great love interest, Clara. They attend a play together, with Clara wearing a green dress. Artist Anne-Marie Jones has exaggerated the neck, and Paul bends down to inconspicuously kiss her arm during the performance. The ninth image is from a time when Paul and Clara visit the Lincolnshire coast, staying in a cottage and living as man and wife. They go out in the early morning to bathe. The description of the scenery comes to life here with the cold winter setting, the land a little darker than the sky, the ocean a flat dark strip with a white edge. Clara undresses and makes her way across the beach to the water, while Paul observes with his artist's perceptions before undressing and joining her in the cold water. The 10th and final image is of Paul kneeling by his mother's body after she's passed on. The green tone of his skin and the expression on his face convey Paul's grief, and the use of red at the ears, the cheeks, and this curious representation of his outstretched hand lend a surreal aspect to the image. Paul later describes his desolation at this loss as a nuit blanche, and we see that imagery evoked here with all the pale white colors around his mother's body. This edition of the novel does close with some back matter. The editor's foreword provides some details on the unexpurgated text, explaining the reasons for the original shortened and censored edition, which was the only edition available to readers for 80 years. This is followed by a series of letters from D.H. Lawrence to his publishers that document his struggles to get the manuscript printed, as he eventually agrees to their edits. Together, these documents provide some context around why the changes were made, and indirectly highlight why this new unaltered version of the text should be considered over the 1913 edition of the novel. I am very proud to add this folio edition of Sons and Lovers to my own book collection. It's an especially classy and striking presentation of the novel, with solid front and back matter, a more up-to-date version of the text itself, and it has a great quality build. On top of that, it features a generous number of dynamic illustrations that perfectly suit the themes of the narrative. With the problematic printing issues that my old paperback edition suffered from, I'm happy moving it to the Box of Doom, because now I have a forever copy of the book to set proudly on my bookshelf. As always, thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for future videos. When it comes to the stories you love, it's always worth upgrading your books.